Hello everyone, I am delighted to be here. I am going to be talking to you today about how we can build a better, more sustainable future for all of us and our future generations together. In order to embark on this journey of building this brighter future, we need to first have a collective vision of what this sustainable, better future is all about. Fortunately for us, in September 2015, 193 countries around the world adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There were 17 goals and 169 granular targets. If you look at all these goals, I am very clear that each of us on this planet would agree that these are all laudable, desirable goals to shoot for, and we would be very proud to live in a world which has all of these goals achieved. You could look at all of these goals through the prism of three very significant developmental challenges that we all confront this century. The first is the climate emergency. Almost 5 of the 17 goals impact or deal with the climate action that we need to take in the climate emergency. The second is about the collapse of nature and biodiversity, the support system, the life support system that we depend on, and that is collapsing. So, how do we deal with that? And about 5 of these goals deal with that in some form or the other. And then the third and the most significant developmental challenge is rising social inequities in terms of systemic poverty, systemic racism, and systemic discrimination of various kinds. These three problems are not isolated problems, or we should address them in silos. These three problems are interconnected with interlocked causes, and therefore we need to try and address and solve for each of them holistically and together. So, let us briefly look at the size of each of these problems and what we can do to try and solve for it. The first is climate emergency. As all of us know, under the UN Paris Accord, we are committing ourselves globally to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade ideally, but not to exceed 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. So, how are we going to achieve it? We have a carbon budget of 572 gigatons. We cannot spend more than that. And in order to make sure that we are under this carbon budget, while the math is daunting, it is still possible for us to achieve it, which means we have to halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and decarbonize by 2050 with no or zero net new emissions by 2050. In order to do that, industries will have to change. Individually, we will have to change as people inhabiting this planet. Sectors will have to come together in pre-competitive collaborative alliances to develop sectoral roadmaps to change. Unless we achieve all of that together, we will not be able to achieve change. Similarly, on the second major developmental challenge, which is the collapse of nature and biodiversity, we have lost about 1 billion hectares of forests in the last 40 years as we have converted this forest for food production. For example, we have got about 27% of the 9,600 plant and animal species at the threat of extinction. And the third and final intractable issue or developmental challenge that we face is that of rising social inequity. The World Bank has said just because of COVID, we are going to see a significant increase in extreme poverty levels. So, the extreme poverty level in the developing countries or the poor countries is $1.90 per person per day, and the World Bank estimates now that there will be an additional 71 to 100 million people falling below that poverty line this year as a result of COVID-19. So, how do we solve for these growing inequalities and systemic poverty in addition to climate emergency and nature and biodiversity collapse? So, there are 5 things that we need to do to really solve for this. The first thing that we need to do is we need to act individually. We need to be the change that we need to see in others. The action gap can only be resolved if first individually we are willing to change, and that is tough, because according to the multiple intelligence theory, where one of the 8 intelligences that we could be blessed with is environmental or naturalistic intelligence, only about 4% of the world's population have that intelligence. The 96% challenge, as I call it, that many of us, including me, who do not have naturalistic or environmental intelligence, how do we change our behavior so that we can change the world. And similarly, every company has to change by following a science-based target to commit to a decarbonization pathway for their companies and to improve issues on inclusivity and diversity and respecting human rights and making sure that their supply chains and the scope 3 emissions are also a responsibility that they will take for themselves. So, for example, there are 144 million rice farmers that grow rice in the world. We are a player in the rice farming business as well as in the rice supply chain business. Of this 144 million farmers, 50% of them earn less than that minimum poverty line definition of $1.90 per day. And 90% of the world's rice farmers, who provide 15% of global calories, we all depend on them, are at or below the poverty line. How do we bring them up to a poverty line, and better still, how do we bring them up to a living income status in terms of catalyzing their livelihoods? In the cocoa business that we are in, the cocoa farmer in Ivory Coast, which is the world's largest cocoa producing country, earns only $2,000 per household, which is well below the $1.90 poverty line definition. The living income for a household growing cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire is estimated by Fair Price International to be around $7,100. So, as a company, we have committed that we will get at least 50,000 people by 2030 to the living income wage in our cocoa supply chains, and 150,000 people by 2030 to a $7,000 living income wage in our cocoa supply chains. So, companies have to change. Third, if a single company in a sector changes and there is only one or two good actors, but not many good actors, it is not going to change the world. So, how do we get the whole pharma industry or the whole energy industry or the whole food and agri industry or the cement industry or the chemicals industry to become sustainable? So, how do we create pre-competitive multi-stakeholder alliances with a sectoral roadmap being drawn on how we can average up our standards and produce in a way, form and manner that is more sustainable? And that is a tough thing to ask, because typically we are competitors, we do not like each other, we hate each other's guts. So, coming together in any kind of pre-competitive alliance is not natural, it is tough. The fourth change that has to happen is government and policy makers have to come to the party and create enabling policy that induces changed behavior towards companies and individuals and households becoming more sustainable. So, we have to advocate for a carbon tax that the governments have to impose, without any risk of carbon pricing arbitrage between poor and rich countries. The European Green Deal is a great example of where they are now saying that there will be a sustainability labeling along with nutrition labeling in food products that are distributed or consumed in Europe, which will then yank all participants to meet that sustainability labeling requirements and act as a catalyst, for example. We have to make sure that governments and policy makers require companies and participants to provide mandatory disclosures on their carbon footprints or greenhouse gas footprints, water footprints, waste footprints, with transparent reporting of those footprints. Last but one point is that we need to make sure that there is a better collaboration between civil society and NGOs and companies in the private sector. We cannot achieve the UN SDGs without the private sector being involved and the civil sector being involved and the government and policy makers being involved. The civil society and NGOs see companies as evil, the companies see them as troublemakers, we are at loggerheads most of the time. But if you want to solve and transform and build this better future that we all want to live in, we need to have these unusual and unnatural coalitions and collaborations that we have not been used to in the past. And finally, we have to incentivize innovators and academicians and science to come up with breakthroughs and innovations that can be game changers that will allow us to do more with less. We need to act on each of these 6 areas if we need to change our individual lives, our families, our companies, the sectors which we participate in and the world, and be proud to live in a world and to bequeath the world to our children and our successive generations